and thank you for inviting us. It's been really exciting 2 days and really enjoyed getting to know your town. Hopefully we can see a bit of Christina tomorrow as well. So just to introduce ourselves, we're both architects from London, and we work together and teach together at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. And today we are going to talk a little bit about our work and our teaching and the relationship that we have to architecture, and looking at this relationship between games and cities, which is kind of our research area, and then finally talk about our backup city project which we did, which was based in Tokyo. So, as I mentioned, we're both we trained as architects, quite conventionally at university. So we're very used to the kind of normal tools that architects use, sketching and modelling, and these are all part of the process. But then we've also, growing up, both of us separately really enjoyed things like comic books and films and video games. So these kind of big speculative worlds, which maybe we look at them as tools to shed light on real cities. So comparing things like this to real problems and what can we learn from them. So these are some concept drawings from Final Fantasy, which maybe you've seen growing up. But what we're interested in is how these can inspire kind of new generations of architects and designers.
So this is the drawings that you just saw are the designers working to create this city that then becomes this video game city that you could explore. And so I guess today what we've been working with everyone for the last 2 days is looking at using video games as a tool for architecture, as a tool for architects to speculate on cities. Because what's really interesting about them is that they allow you to place someone in the world. I'm sure any of you have played a video game and you've experienced being placed in a world that has its own particular rules or rhythms, and getting to know that through playing it. So we're quite interested how it can be a tool for understanding cities, but how it also kind of is a continuation of the way that people have always speculated through drawings and representations and things. So some of the work that we do looks at video game cities that already exist. So this is the city of Los Santos from Grand Theft Auto 5, which originally came out in 2013. And you can kind of see that, as an image, it looks very much like the real LA that we see in films or we may have visited. But because it's a game city, it has its own kind of rules, and we're really interested in what you might learn from those rules. So part of our research has been examining virtual cities and the logics that they give to the player, how they kind of control the way the player moves and what the player can do. To do this, we do things like making big drawings. So this drawing is like 5 meters wide, and it is kind of exploring the logics behind Los Santos as a city. We also do things like making books. So how could you reframe a virtual city by taking screenshots or photographs of that city, maybe putting them into a book, which almost makes it look like it's a real place, even though it's a virtual world. And then this is comparing on Google Earth the size of the real Los Angeles to the size of this virtual Los Angeles. You can see it's absolutely tiny because the game designers wanted to create a world that made you feel like you're in Los Angeles without all of the boring bits of real Los Angeles, which is driving for hours and hours and being in traffic and things like that. So the real city and the virtual city, although they have the same kind of effect on the brain in many respects, are very different in terms of their scale. So this has led us on to making our own architectural video games. This is an early game we made called Ubiquity, which is basically like a landscape of repeating kind of gas stations that goes off forever. So no matter how far you walk through the world, there's more and more and more of them. The gas station being a sign of this kind of American landscape of the car As we've come to experience when we got the taxi down to Jakova, you guys have got some very exuberant and interesting gas stations at night with loads of lights. So it was kind of quite interesting because it reminded us a lot of these kind of American landscapes as well, where everything's lit up at night.
And so, alongside kind of studying virtual cities, we also like to explore how the tools and the software used to create different digital forms or virtual forms might be used to kind of contribute or influence our design process. So this was actually some sketches where we were looking at this idea of resolution. So how you might have an object which has like multiple forms, getting more and more detailed or getting less detailed, and how if you might combine those and actually like begin to distort an object digitally, how that might lead to something quite interesting, both visually and spatially. And we were inspired by this kind of concept, some studies that were done by Maholi Nagy, I don't know if you've heard of this artist, who did lots of camouflage studies during the war to protect Lake Michigan. So he proposed these series of islands, like fake islands, which would be used to kind of detract attention from the real Michigan, to kind of protect it. So we were looking at voxel software, which is called Magic Voxel, to generate different versions of the same object, as I mentioned before, gaining resolution or losing resolution, and how you might start to combine those to create an object with multiple resolutions. So this was actually, it's manifested as a space kiosk, which could be used for different functions, such as a debating chamber to hold podcasts or a radio station, and it would sit on Lake Michigan as a reminder of these kind of islands that were proposed many years ago. So we're also quite interested in this idea of an architectural toy. So as well as like virtual games, how you might start to create physical games that maybe deal with different architectural concepts. So the video game is a medium which invites like lots of different users to participate. So also how a toy might be able to invite people who maybe aren't so used to architectural ideas to kind of be more involved and to understand them perhaps in an easier way. So this was actually looking at Disneyland and this kind of kingdom that has been created, and it's quite an interesting urban plan in itself, because it's a place which, I don't know if any of you have been to Disney, but it's a place which holds different worlds in like one small zone, so you can kind of see how that compares to a video game city, in the fact that they're trying to get all of these different worlds into one smaller zone. So we were interested in the different planning rules and things, and how that leads to this kind of unique urban environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they have a series of designers called Imagineers, so it's like imagination meeting engineers. And yeah, Disney is such a kind of carefully composed world where they don't want you to see the edges, where, you know, they obviously, all of these rides have to be housed in big buildings and things like that. But they're very, very careful in the way that they structure this kind of fantasy land. And so there's lots of interesting kind of techniques they have, like painting things certain colours, using tricks of perspective to make things look maybe like they're further away, or to make things look bigger than they are, to make, like, if you go and touch the rocks in Disneyland, you see that they're actually like kind of poured concrete or cast onto sort of frameworks and things like that. So whereas a video game is kind of made from 3D models, or as we've been doing today, maybe like bringing drawings into this world, I think we're really interested in all the techniques that a real company uses to make this kind of fantastical world, and so that they can preserve this idea of fantasy for the people that visit it.
So what we wanted to do was actually make something which looked like a toy, resembled a toy, but that you could operate with your hands and actually take this to the park. And the idea is that when you hold it up, each one of these different pieces in turn kind of reveals the kind of secrets of the urban planning as you hold it up against it. So this was the device. So it's also meant to operate a bit like a clock. So different parts would unfold and you could kind of calibrate it when you held it up against different parts. So, for example, like these pink and green bars, as we've mentioned, they have colours where if something's under construction, they paint it green and they actually call it go away green. So that's why on here, when I was holding it up to one of these cranes, you kind of change the landscape of the toy to become green.
I mean, I think the other thing that's kind of interesting in this is that with like digital fabrication technologies like 3D printing and CNC milling, we can kind of make things that almost, I mean, maybe it doesn't have the exact same quality as like a mass-produced toy, which would have obviously come from a mould and then be cast out of plastic, you know, because they're making thousands and thousands. But it's quite easy now, if you have those facilities, to be able to kind of conceive of a 3D model of something and then output it. You know, all of the little parts in here actually move and work, and all of the mechanisms were designed and then 3D printed, and once it comes out, it kind of almost functions as it's kind of very easy using these technologies now to actually make things that you could imagine this thing being sold in Disneyland in some ways, because the quality is not so far off these kind of commercial toys that you can also get.
You know, we actually put it in a box as if it was being branded by Disney. It's a toy which you can go and take to the parks and have this accompanied guide which would tell you different places in the park where you might be able to hold it up and use it. So ultimately we're interested in this as a tool for engagement with particular architectural ideas and contexts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the key points of the work that we're doing at the moment. And as we said earlier, is that you know, architecture can be quite a difficult field for people who aren't, you know, familiar with it to get into.
Yeah.
But through using toys or through using video games, you know, similar to how other architects have investigated films, we hope that there's the potential to kind of engage people with design process of cities by using mediums that are kind of very accessible, that many people are used to using.
Yeah. So this is another, I guess, architectural toy that we made on a much larger scale. So this was actually for the London 2012 Olympics. The Mayor of London commissioned a series of installations that would kind of celebrate something about London. So we chose to look at Alan Turing, who actually, I guess you could say, he invented the computer. So we wanted to build this huge visual computer toy, which would also make a cup of tea at the end of it. So this actually counted added up in binary, and each one of these runs is a different part of the tea making process. It's probably easier to explain.
There's these things in the UK, I don't know if you have here, but they're called Teasmades, and it's like a kind of alarm clock combined with a kettle. So it wakes you up in the morning and it makes you a cup of tea at the same time, because obviously being British, we love our tea in the morning. So the kind of concept was like, what if we made that to the scale of a building, you know, kind of like the size of this room, and that people could watch all of these processes happening, and it would become a kind of really interesting event which people could interact with.
But at the same time, again, it's like an educational tool which shows people actually this. If you strip it down to its bare basics, this is how a computer is calculating. You know, it's calculating in binary addition, and you know, I didn't know how to count in binary before we made this, and I think I made some quite bad cups of tea as a result of it. So this is a little video showing how it works.
So each person will be basically given a number that they'd have to then use binary addition to work out the correct number by adding through binary, the way that a computer would do. And these mechanisms here are logic gates, so they're 1 or 0, so depending on whether you've got 1 ball or 2 balls sitting in this thing, it physically actually moves. This is kind of inspired by, again, some old toys and games that were used for educational purposes in like the 1950s. And so if you add things up correctly, the computer, which was powered by an Arduino, this thing here, will perfectly make this cup of tea, whereas if you don't add up things properly...
It might skip your milk, or you might have hot water and no tea bag, or you might just have a tea bag and no... Like, there was always a cup, but maybe you won't get sugar. So you get these kids kind of bashing buttons and giving their parents a really horrible cup of tea. But hopefully some people learn how to add up in binary as a result of this.
And so I think this is another project that's looking at London, so obviously the city that we come from, and London's kind of in an interesting, difficult situation at the moment in that it's always been quite an expensive city, but it's now so full of like very high-end, very expensive residential developments that lots of people are being pushed out of London. And it also is kind of changing the culture of London. So all of these developments, they kind of seem to work in a different way. You know, British people, maybe rightly or wrongly, are generally sort of described as being kind of quiet and modest. But all of these developments, they tend to sort of shout about how amazing they are, how luxurious they are. And the advertisements for these developments are like, they're all over London. Every single street has it. Even, you know, some of the neighbourhoods that were previously quite poor have now got these big developments coming in. And
they're almost like selling a lifestyle, I guess. Each one is saying, like, you know, come to this quarter and behave in this way, and if you live here in this penthouse, you can look like this, and they're very out of place to anyone who has actually like lived in London before it was this wealthy or this kind of full of these developments.
Yeah, so in early 2015, one of these developers made this kind of promotional video that got quite a lot of publicity and then got taken down off the internet. I don't know if any of you have seen or read the book by Bret Easton Ellis or seen the film American Psycho, but it's all about this like 1980s America where like everyone's really greedy and this kind of language of excess, and this video kind of captured this, where you've got this character here who works in the City of London as a banker, who's basically defeating everyone in the financial markets, and then he comes home and he gets in the lift and every woman finds him amazingly attractive, and then he goes into his flat and he looks out over London, and everyone sort of said, like, this is really like a horrible image to kind of promote, but we kind of found it quite interesting because this is the image that is increasingly promoted by these type of advertisements.
But at the same time, you know, London's also facing from like a massive housing crisis, so there's a real shortage of homes, and like people are getting, there's more homeless people, there's more people unable to live in London anymore, and people are just getting driven out, so to have that contrasting with this strange other lifestyle which no one can really relate to is really interesting.
So this is a game called the London Developers Toolkit that we've been developing. It's a kind of satirical game that imagines a future. I guess it's kind of a bit complicated, but so many of these buildings tend to look the same and they have the same type of facilities, and so the kind of argument that we make, which is maybe a bit of a joke, but is that maybe we don't need the architect anymore because these buildings are so similar in what they portray as a kind of way of living that we can just have this bit of software that someone plays. So for instance, you know, the architect does these amazing napkin sketches. It's so inspirational and people want to buy this. So the idea is in this game that you start off by proving that you've got the kind of same level of inspiration as an architect, as a great architect, by sketching this napkin sketch. And then, you know, there's a lot of work being done now in parametric design, but all of these buildings tend to work in like luxury, and that's not really something that you can turn into a parameter because it's more of a kind of cultural thing. we're thinking, what if you could move these sliders around to make something more or less luxurious? So as the player goes through this game, it's kind of developing this little tower that cycles through randomly. And then you start picking which boroughs of London you want to put these developments in, or which boroughs of London have kind of given themselves over to allowing these developments to happen, which are often quite controversial as well. And there's been a bit of reaction in some parts of the city to, the council saying, we'll let these developments happen, and people saying, no, we don't actually want them. So, we can probably skip through a bit more, but at the end of the game, it basically gives you like a kind of crap version of Photoshop, where you can make like a promotional poster for your development. So you can choose what background you want, you can choose what context you want, whether you want it to be in the countryside. You can put kind of, these adverts always have people like, whether it's powerful bankers or like hipsters, they're always used to sell the lifestyle behind these buildings. So the idea is that basically you can make your own kind of advertisement at the end of this process for this sort of fictional building that's kind of slightly taking the piss out of the kind of advertisements that we see all over London streets in reality. So maybe your building is so good that it gets put right next to Buckingham Palace because it's such an amazing piece of architecture. And in the end, the posh British people are the ones who might end up living in this thing. So we kind of imagine these posters almost becoming a protest against the way that London's skyline is going, and people placing these all around the city. Or one of the other things that we've been working with recently is the idea of making this into a gallery piece where people can actually use this booth and kind of maybe 3D print the bits that they've created from their buildings alongside these posters. And sort of developing this into a more larger scale toy which looks at the kind of growth of London through a gigantic game that people can participate in.
And so another project that kind of plays on this idea of a game and involving the public and trying to say something through community and opinion is called the Planning Portal. So this uses the kind of logics and the visual characteristics of the game to collect opinions from the community. And so this is a process diagram of how we imagined, you'd have these issues like such a lack of transport, lack of public space, lack of greenery, and then basically through the design of this pavilion you'd be able to go inside and you'd be able to vote almost like a poll. So it would ask you questions, and when you say yes or no, you put a ball through one of these straw poles, and then you could see the results each day kind of mapped out onto its facade. So you can see here, like maybe some of the questions would be less popular and some would be really popular, and this would be in a public space and you could actually display the results of this opinion onto the facade, almost like a physical graph. And we imagine if you ask the same questions to someone in London, or to someone in the north of the country, to the east of the country, maybe you'd get completely different results based on opinion. And I guess that's quite relevant now with the whole Brexit issue and how London sees itself as a different opinion to the rest of the country. So how this could travel around and be a marker of these different opinions.
Yeah, we also in this model we used candy for the little balls, so after you finish the model you can eat it, which is quite good as well.
Yeah. So as we mentioned, we both teach together at the Bartlett. We teach urban design, and we've been doing that for a year now. But what we really wanted to test, which we don't feel, we've been told hasn't really been done before in architectural education, is how urban designers and architects will actually utilise video games as like another medium. So instead of making drawings, or as well as making drawings, or physical models and all these traditional tools, how we actually might start to make video games similar to the kind of things we've been exploring in our own work, but how we might do that as an architecture student or as an urban design student, to kind of speak about buildings, cities and places and real issues, but be inspired by these more speculative virtual techniques.
Yeah, so we run RC12, so that's Research Cluster 12 on the Bartlett Masters Urban Design Programme, where we have students from around the world. They spend one calendar year, so they actually hand it in on Monday, and we're marking them on Monday. So yeah, it's quite an interesting, it's a course that has quite a lot of potential for experimentation and experimental methods, I think.
So this is a kind of quick show reel of some of the games that the students made. So we went to LA for our field trip, and this one's looking at, LA has these case study houses which were all designed to kind of showcase a different method or technique, and so they were done, what, like 20, 30 years ago? Longer than that, 50 years ago. And so we decided to make some new case study houses in a video game with these different ambitions that a modern day resident of LA would have. So whether they want the sunniest house or the house with the most parking or the greenest house, and how you'd actually be able to go up to these different houses and almost play them to kind of unfold this different goal. This one was looking at, so LA has faced a number of changes, going from being this natural place to having lots of man-made infrastructure and technology being placed upon it. So in this game you'd have these different launchers, so one which would symbolise development, one which would symbolise the man-made landscape, and one which would return it back to being natural.
Yeah, for instance, LA has its famous river, which is a big kind of concrete storm drain, and they're actually doing a lot of work to try and like break that down and kind of return it to a natural environment that people might actually want to use, because although it's very kind of symbolic in films, it's not necessarily always used as much as it could be.
And the third game is about consumption in LA, and how, you know, when you go there, it's all these kind of crazy lights and brands, and there's Hollywood, and there's lots of things trying to get you to eat stuff and play stuff and listen to things, and how you might create this game which basically saturated all of those into different zones, different areas. So the idea is that you go through the game and you kind of consume as you play, and then you end up following this yellow line which will lead you to, actually, you can't see it here, but it's a massive M symbolising Big McDonald's, which has taken over the whole of LA. So these are just some screenshots of the games. So the students are able to also make really cool drawings out of the video games as well. So it's kind of like you're making an experiential game, but you're also taking things out of the game and analysing them in an architectural sense as well. So these are each of the case study houses, and how each of them have different behaviours and different puzzles, and getting people. I guess the thing with a drawing is you always have to fix the viewpoint, so you have to decide whether you're going to be looking at it as a person, here's the city, or sometimes we only ever design and plan when we're looking at a city. The thing with a video game is you can choose. You can choose to have multiple angles, so you can experience the city from above and from the street, which is actually, we feel like, almost like takes the design process to another level where you need to be doing both.
Yeah, because in this game, for instance, they're using the split screen because they're really interested in how maybe like effects that someone makes on a house at one scale then has a ripple effect. It kind of spreads. So once someone's like completed a particular house, the logic of that house then starts to spread into the other houses. It's kind of like the phrase like keeping up with the Joneses. This idea that when someone does something to their own individual property, other people in the neighbourhood might start to follow because they've kind of established a rule or a way of living. So at the end of the game, you might have walked around it in the first person, like a person actually on the ground, but you start to see from the aerial view, like almost a master plan of how this town has changed.
That's kind of the result of the.
Yeah, this was the overall thing.
So just some more screenshots, and with this game as well. So the other interesting thing is that each player can have a different effect on the city, so you might play it differently to the person sitting next to you or the person before you, so you'd end up with a different city each time, which was really interesting.
So the latest games that we've been doing with the students have been looking back at London. So again, kind of similar to what we've already discussed, they're looking at issues that London faces. For instance, the biggest issue that's on the horizon is obviously Brexit. And this is a game that some students have made called eLondon. And they're interested by places like in Estonia, you can basically get an e-citizenship, I think, where you can, or an e-residency, where you can establish a business in Estonia via the internet, and that business can operate entirely out of Estonia without you having to live there. And so Estonia is obviously using it as a way to bring investment into their country. But it's kind of really interesting because it's using digital interfaces, the internet, to kind of connect people together. And so they thought, what if people in London who voted, to not leave the European Union could use digital interfaces to kind of stay in the European Union? So looking at technologies like augmented reality, whether they could kind of connect themselves into, I think the EU has something called the digital single market that they're developing. So the whole concept of this game is that this is someone who has basically bought an app that lets them become that lets them stay a citizen of the EU. So you wake up in your kind of bad flat in the post-Brexit, the stock markets have crashed.
You've got rubbish food because there's no bacon, nothing being imported into the country anymore. You failed your report at school because your professor had to go back to their country.
England lost it to Germany before, as usual. That's never going to change.
Then you kind of find this amazing present on your doorstep, which happens to be a pair of virtual reality glasses that take you into this pre-Brexit world where you can live out your life as if nothing had ever happened, as if we hadn't made this stupid decision.
So for instance, an English tea room that's closed at night, when you put your glasses on it turns into an Italian espresso bar. And so they're kind of interested, it's quite sort of humorous, but there's a sort of serious undertone to things of how our way of life is going to change, how our relationship to other countries is going to change, and whether we can use technology to kind of help us stay in contact with people.
Different cultures, different amenities, different facilities that might not, are massively under risk now. No one knows what's going to happen.
But I think the cool thing about using the game is this mechanism of putting these glasses on and the world changing is exactly what video games were made for. So maybe, this is a screenshot, a drawing might not tell the story in the same way a film could do that, but you can actually play and you can decide when you want to go from being in the UK to being this European citizen. I think that's quite interesting.
So just very quickly, it's another game about London. So in London, when there's a development happening, so construction, building works, we have these little yellow papers that the council pins up on a lamppost, and they tell you, we have planned a block of flats, it's going to be built, and you have to really notice them. Sometimes they fall to the ground, and a lot of people have been saying, I didn't know that this work was going to happen, but actually there was this tiny yellow paper on a lamppost that no one notices. So their game is a critique of how, what would be possible if we only looked at these notices. They have really vague titles. So as I said, they might just say block of flats planned in this area. But in the language, they were looking at how things might be twisted, and you might be able to build a lot more, just based on that one sentence. So here we can see all these different different sites and different planning applications layered on top of each other. And the idea of the game is we don't have a video, but you'd be offered. I don't think there is. Okay, no, we do have a video. So you're kind of going down and choosing a planning application to go and explore. So this one says, erect a plinth and bronze bust, which, you know, is so super vague. So they were exploring what are the possibilities within the word plinth, how many different types of plinth, you know, how big is the plinth, where does the plinth sit, how many different configurations of plinth, and so...
It's basically like a game that allows the player to build structures, and then when they built their structures, they ask the planning regulation officer, does this structure fulfill what this notice says? Because as Sandra said, these notices are very vague. Sometimes, you could imagine 100 different things that would still have the same description. So the whole point of this game is that maybe the planning notice is so kind of open to interpretation by people that we can build all these weird and wonderful structures within the game, and they're all actually still they still fit with that original notice. So here someone is building like a massive plinth that's really weird and sort of strange shapes, and then they're going to start putting the bust, you know, the sculpture on top. But in the end, if it is a plinth with a bust on it, with a sculpture, it's still technically, in terms of that planning notice, is something that does make sense, even if it looks kind of ludicrous. So they're kind of really interested in how the planning process in London now and regulation might take advantage of technology to kind of communicate more clearly with people, with citizens, about what's going on in their city.
Yeah. And so they actually proposed that what if you were able to see the proposal in 3D, maybe by scanning the QR code, holding your phone over it and being able to see the 3D version of what's proposed rather than just, you know, a really vague sentence.
So this is some other students who are, so I don't know if you're aware, but London's got, I don't think it has the most anymore, but it has, it's in the top few for the number of CCTV cameras across the city. So people in London are some of the most watched and recorded in the world. And so this game is called Snooper's Charter, which is after a bit of legislation about what people can look at, what the government can look at in terms of recording citizens and their activity. And so this group has made an open world London where you're this guy who's trying to escape surveillance, and so you kind of act to sort of I guess interrupt or subvert surveillance systems of London to sort of remove yourself from these surveillance protocols that are always watching you. So for instance, drones blending into a crowd.
Using camouflage, digital camouflage on certain buildings.
Yeah, there's even systems now that they've been researching that facial recognition that churches use to find if people are going to mass regularly enough, which is quite interesting. So you can't lie about having gone because your face is being recorded.
So this is another game looking at London's high streets. So, you know, essentially this city has a high street. This town has a high street, and it's really important to the community. But we see all these big brands like, you know, McDonald's and Nike and Costa taking them over. Oh, that was a very fast video. So the idea of this game is that you have to click really, really, really fast to fight against these chain stores before they completely take over.
So they're growing, and you're trying to fight them back. They looked at a bit of research, which is talking about what are called clone towns. So clone being that everything looks the same, and this kind of governmental think tank was sort of arguing that although somewhere like London has lots of distinct boroughs, they end up looking the same because you find exactly the same shops in every high street. So how can we start to fight against that and maybe build different characters in different parts of the city, because that would be more interesting. So So that's some of the work that we've been doing with our students. So now I think we're going to talk a bit more about the project, the backup Tokyo project, that was what we submitted to Future Architecture, and what kind of forms this idea of the backup Jakova that we've been working on the last couple of days. I guess to give a little bit of background, Backup Tokyo obviously is in Japan, and we've been really interested in like Japanese culture and particularly video game culture in Japan. And actually the project was inspired by a trip to this really amazing arcade, which is in it's in Kawasaki, just outside of Tokyo. And this is the entrance from the car park. So the whole building's like this kind of video game world. It's really crazy. You have to go over this like slime to get in and everything. And when you go in, you've got like the Japanese pachinko, these kind of classic machines where all these balls drop through. You've got arcade games. There's me playing Initial D. But what we're really fascinated by is there's these kind of gambling games they have called medal games, and you basically like you pay money and you get these tokens, and you put them into these gigantic machines, and some of them are like almost half the size of this room, and they have these really elaborate mechanisms that move these little balls and things like that through the machines. And we thought, like, well, these look kind of really weird and crazy. They're amazing. So what are they? And we researched into them a bit more, and they're quite fascinating because in Japanese culture, gambling is illegal unless it's on 4 sports. So you're not allowed to gamble with money, but you can pay money to get these tokens, and then if you win things with these tokens, you receive a prize at the end of it. And the token itself is has a lot of history in Japanese culture. It's something that it's been used for a long time in terms of like religious and social practice. So for instance, these are tokens called omamori that you would take to a temple to get a blessing. And so they have omamori to give you good luck in different, like in your schoolwork or in your business. So this is a little omamori for someone who works in the IT industry. And then they also have a tradition of like carved ivory. So these are little things called netsuki that would be carried to in the old days when the Japanese people would wear kimonos. They would all the time they would have these little pockets, and the netsuki would like basically weigh down your pocket, so you'd tie it around your belt. But they'd be symbolic of like I don't know, some point of your family's history or something like that. And they also have these other things called netsuki, called manja netsuki, which are like almost like coins. So there's this kind of history of using tokens. And if you've been to Tokyo, they also have these machines in like the Akihabara and Ibukuro districts called gachapon, where you put in your money and you get out this little funny toy in a little pod. So the kind of context of this was that Japan has this like legal and cultural history that relates to tokens. And so some of these machines are kind of really crazy. This is the Medal Tower of Babel, so obviously the story of the Tower of Babel, but these coins just stack up and up and up and up. Maybe. And so you can kind of get an idea of the music is kind of crazy, and this whole thing is like a sort of overload of the senses when you see them working.
Yeah, the fact that they're based on real architectural kind of scenarios and buildings themselves really interested us as well.
It's like a mini Tokyo Tower, Eiffel Tower type thing. Yeah. So the medal game kind of inspired us on this project, Tokyo Backup City. So this project emerged from us reading about, I think in 2011, following the tsunami, a Japanese politician, Jime Ishii, I think, proposed, well, basically it's sort of known that Tokyo is going to have another massive earthquake at some point in the relatively near future. So he proposed, let's build a backup Tokyo because all the governmental facilities are there. It's going to site it in an airport in Osaka. which is quite interesting because Tokyo and Osaka are like traditional rival cities, and they have very different cultures, even down to like the dialect. And so to take this back up Tokyo and place it in Osaka is quite kind of contentious. But the idea was that this is one of their designs, that all of the government would go there if Tokyo was destroyed in an earthquake. But before that happens, it would also become like this business district, and it would have these kind of weird like leisure activities like an American sporty stadium, a Caribbean resort, a Euro healing palace, I'm not sure what that is. But they would basically wanted to create this development. And where this kind of relates to the gambling is that one of the things they wanted to do in this backup city was to introduce like American style casinos like you'd get in Las Vegas, for instance, or you'd get in Macau near Hong Kong, which are at the moment kind of illegal in Japan. So they were almost using this idea of we need to build this backup city for Tokyo to then start to sneak in these types of gambling institutions that currently are not legal.
Yeah, and I guess just to go back to this image and these two images really, what really struck us about this proposal, architecturally, was that it looks nothing like Tokyo, and the fact that they were designing it in this way to make it appeal to other cultures and to other parts of the world, or to try and make it look as like little relation to Japanese, aesthetic as possible, really interests us as to like why such a move away to try and be more Western when you have this amazing like culture and heritage yourself.
Yeah, it could maybe preserve the government facilities, but it couldn't preserve the culture of the city of Tokyo and its built environment. So I guess in response to these medal games and arcades and things like that, we kind of proposed an alternative vision for this city, which kind of reflects the crazy architecture that you see in Tokyo, the fact that there seems to be like, in very different to London in many ways, that there's kind of lots of different styles that clash together, and you've obviously got the neon lights and the noise and all of the people that move through the city, which is not there in the proposal that these people projected. So we were kind of inspired by the medal game, as we've just talked about, and how that maybe if we scale them up, because they're already like miniature buildings, how we might be able to use those to sort of design cities. So we found the patent drawings for how they design the mechanisms, and we were kind of fascinated by how these things, they look like architectural models, but they've actually got incredibly complex systems behind the way that they work. But at the same time, when you look at this, it almost looks like a drawing of a castle or some kind of city centre. And so, starting to look at how, for instance, this one, the Tower of Babel, where it builds it, how it's like always twisting and adding something in. And we were kind of interested about how maybe we might design a city where people are the tokens and the machine is the city. So this is someone playing this game where it makes this massive tower, and I think they're about to get lucky. So someone's going to get lots of prizes for that. But as we make drawings, we started by using these patent drawings and starting to work into them.
So, as designers and coming at this from, I guess, an architectural perspective, we decided to return to Tokyo, the real Tokyo, not the Tokyo that maybe someone else wants it to be, and began extracting different parts of Tokyo. Just as we've been doing with some of you in the workshop, going around the city, going around the town, picking out the important elements, the elements that we feel like really represent the culture, the heritage, and the urban and natural fabric of Tokyo, and how we might start to combine those into one zone, which would sit on the site that they proposed as an alternative, and how these might all be tied together in some kind of system, weaving together. So you have these like dense zones, which each celebrate a different thing, but tied together through a kind of infrastructural link that would weave in and out of each one.
So this is the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Building. You can go up to the top and look over. It's got an amazing view. But it's designed by Kenzo Tange, and it's designed to look like a giant microchip. So it already has this symbolism of like looking like something that relates to a computer. And so we imagined that because all of this like administrative and governmental facilities would need to be stored and all of their data, that we kind of recreate this building as a giant like data warehouse, where all of the kind of legal and governmental side of Tokyo will be backed up to.
And so the kind of natural landscapes, so there's this one mountain, Mount Takao, which actually people visit it, and they hope that by going in its waters that they'll kind of be healed, and it has this like element of well-being. So we proposed this as an alternative to this weird idea that they had called the Euro Healing Palace. You know, why not have actually take elements of Mount Takao and something that to Japanese people symbolises health and well-being, and we'd actually create these different versions of the mountain that would act almost like shrines for health, and almost like symbols of well-being in the city.
So as we mentioned, there's 4 sports that are legal to gamble on in Japan. It's kind of interesting as well because, you know, the token in these games is like an anonymous object. It's like a ball or a little coin. But in these sports, so you've got speedway, you've got horse racing, and they have these kind of miniature, like these would also be classed as member games where you have the little miniature, horse racing games that you watch, like virtual horse racing and gamble on it. And it then kind of becomes sort of quite surreal. So these are like these sort of non-interactive video games where you watch a horse race being run and gamble on it. But because it's kind of Japan and everything's sort of slightly strange from time to time, the horses sort of also change as well. So there's this kind of element of fun to these games as well that we think would be interesting to bring into a backup Tokyo. So here's the sort of...
Very strange. Elvis scores. The zebra? Why not?
But there's also cycling and powerboat racing, and in this it's not like, let's say, the Tour de France or something where the cyclist has a name and you know who they are. Everyone kind of is quite anonymous and they just wear colours and you just bet on the colour of people. So it's almost like the tokens come back again. The boats, they don't necessarily have names as such. So this is a tower which has like a horse racing track, it has like baseball venues, it has speedways and things like that, but it also has a giant subway station. It's right at the centre of the urban plan, and on the upper levels there's like a miniature, like augmented reality version of the subway station where people actually gamble on the salarymen, the people coming to work every day are like the little tokens in the machine that people have designed to understand. But then Tokyo has like its business districts, but it also has more informal places. So this is in Shinjuku, in kind of central Tokyo, and it's called Piss Alley, and it got its name because apparently people used to get drunk and they used to urinate and then it would run down the hill. But it has lots and lots of tiny little restaurants where they do like grilled meat called yakitori. And so this is like one of these places where businessmen also go to eat, so they might go to have like informal meetings there where they eat and drink, lots of meat, lots of beer, and we're kind of interested in this being like a different sort of urban ecology for the city, but also using this to irrigate, so taking these kind of ideas of pathways where water runs and starting to use that to kind of irrigate the city.
And Tokyo also has really interesting shaped buildings, and the reason everything's kind of angled is because they, all of their planning laws, or a lot of their planning laws, are determined by sunshine. So you have a building which might sit next to another one but has to angle in a certain way in order for sunlight to reach. And they do this at all sides. Usually it's only on one or two sides. But the interesting thing is that they're building up and up and up, and the buildings are kind of snaking in and out of each other. So we thought that was quite an interesting way that a city might grow, and how you might have these kind of different housing zones that develop in relation to the amount of daylight that each kind of part in between these bigger meadows are getting. So we started, obviously we modelled them together and started placing, modelled them separately as separate ideas, separate medals, and then thought, how do these things start to collide and how do they come together? What relationships do they form with each other? How can we begin to experience them as a sequence? And also, what kind of visual aesthetic does this place have? Is it, we saw the images from before, which have these green grasses and these grey buildings, something we see all over the world, very generic. So what are the colours of Tokyo? And to us, when you walk through the streets, your eyes almost get burnt by all these different lights. And when you look at a light and you look away, you still have that kind of imprint in your eyes of these different lights. So we thought, how can you start to translate that into a drawing and into an atmosphere? And to us, that's what Tokyo looks like. Actually trying to communicate these ideas through a set of drawings. So we began thinking, how through drawing can we communicate this mania, this craziness in a static object? And so we produced these two drawings, one which is a kind of overview of all the medals, and one which is a more cutaway, a detail of one of them. So you can see here.
Yeah, so this kind of shows the landscape, maybe partially, but how these things would kind of almost clash together. The kind of urban design of it is quite frenetic, but it would then generate this kind of intensity, because the site, although it's an airport, it's not actually anywhere near the size of a city, obviously. So how to get this kind of intensity of the different neighbourhoods and areas of Tokyo and its surroundings into a site that's far, far smaller. And then this is through the sports medals. So what would these, we kind of conceived of these medals from the medal games as being these kind of big hub buildings that would contain lots of sort of facilities and lots of activities. So kind of opening this up and thinking about how this would start to work as this kind of big kind of skyscraper that would have thousands of people contained within it with all of these activities.
And I guess we started off with drawings, but we actually wanted to, because we were interested in the video game, think about how we might start to inhabit this world beyond just a static drawing. So we began kind of tracing this journey through all of these different elements, and starting to think of how you might start to place this into a virtual environment that you could experience at a different level.
Yeah, and what's the kind of, I guess the underlying logic of all of the infrastructure, of the travel, of the services, of, the traffic lights, because the medal games have this kind of logic where they're seemingly random, but there's people with lots of time on their hands on the internet who try and work out what percentage chance have you got of winning if the machine's behaving in this particular type of way. So in a way they're kind of deconstructing these arcade games almost in the way that we can start to analyse cities and understand patterns of behaviour. And so together all these elements form this kind of urban morphology of a backup Tokyo that we see as a kind of argument for a different future compared to the kind of sterile version that was officially proposed. And then we also started to think about how we could then incorporate this into Unity, into a game engine, and kind of using these techniques of split screens again with these kind of flat colours to make almost like these moving drawings that take you through the city at multiple viewpoints at once. That kind of, I think we're kind of interested in the idea of disorientation as well, of how these colours and lights and architecture can make the city kind of quite disorientating, and how we might use a video game to kind of also create that same feeling for someone in terms of the urban planning. So rather than the clear-cut zones of the real plan, something that's a lot more kind of intertwined and more indeterminate.
And then I guess as an effect of those, that video game, this disorientation, we produced another set of drawings. So for us, going from the kind of research to the drawing to the video game, back out of the video game for another set of drawings, I don't know, it's kind of like an ongoing process which can essentially go on forever, and maybe this project will. So we created these new versions of the medal that were kind of a result of playing the game. So before, where we drew them out as these almost like architectural drawings, they're then placed into the game and come out again as a result of the kind of visual effects and the experience. And we created these as again, the colours that burn your eyes when you look at these objects and you look away.
The reflection in the pool of water of a neon sign being reflected in the rain or something like that, and how that itself kind of creates new architectural spaces of reflection. And so, yeah, we're kind of interested in how these games have lots of flashing lights, lots of noises and sounds, but there's something that's kind of really hard to understand about them. One, because we don't speak or read Japanese, which doesn't help, but also because their design is designed to kind of make them quite hard to make out, because they're arcade machines that want to take people's money. But in some ways that's kind of like real cities. One person can probably not understand the totality of a city, but they can understand the city from their own point of view. They might understand the city as being rather more complex than people who look at it to plan the city think that it is, because if you're on the ground and if you have issues of money and culture and things like that, cities are very complicated. So we've kind of used these medal games as a way of critiquing cities and of designing a city that we think reflects our own kind of understanding of Tokyo and its complexities. I'm sure maybe a Japanese person or a Tokyo resident would say there's different things that are important if you were to back up Tokyo. But this idea of what you preserve, what you promote, what you might forget, how you might see a city in a different way through kind of backing it up, I think is what we've been exploring as a research agenda for a while now, and what we've been exploring for the last 2 days with our intrepid bunch of students.
So I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much for listening.
So now I think if we just switch quickly, computers, we have the premiere of the backup Jacoba. You can find that one.
With some music as well.
Okay, so for those of you who weren't there, we've spent 2 days and we basically started by having a walk around the city because we don't know it, but you guys do. And then we've done a series of drawings that you can see on the back wall that are kind of, I guess, fragments from the city, fragments from the architecture, from the culture. And then we've tried to make a moving drawing in a sense, which is actually kind of quite small, but we only had 2 days.
Yeah.
But so everyone's kind of taken their own personal responses and we've worked it. So we can see all of the different parts of Jacoba that people have kind of responded to and drawn. The buildings, the kind of architecture, even bits of the kind of traditional carpets, the floors, the tower blocks that are kind of going up and down, the mountains in the background, maybe walking along the central streets with the hanging lamps between things, and the traditional kind of timber frontages. So in a sense it's like a kind of moving drawing where, I won't look in that bit because there's a gap. So maybe as we cross the river.
In the river.
Yeah.
You're having a swim because the river's now clean.
We can come through to the amphitheatre and we can look back across the city. We didn't have time to put into the picture. But essentially we're kind of interested. I think this is something, you know, with more time we could develop further, and maybe we can give you guys the files and you can have a play with them. But how you can make like a kind of virtual memory of your city that maybe is not like exactly geographically like your city, but kind of plays with some of the things that you might remember, some of the things that you find very like symbolically powerful about the city, and it's kind of drawn from your memories and your experiences, what you like, what you dislike. And I think, you know, being able to make these kind of virtual inhabitable spaces is kind of like potentially really interesting, because it almost becomes like, you know, like ethnography, like understanding how people use cities, how they remember it, and being able to kind of bring it back. And I think this is just mirrored, because the idea was that we should kind of come out through this. But we end up at the front door, and if you look through, then we'd be in this very room here. So, yeah, thank you for everyone's work with this.
Yeah, well
You've got
done
some really
everyone
interesting
who
ideas.
contributed.